It's a pleasure to welcome our YouTube audience this morning. Magic Mountain here, Wernersville, Pennsylvania, July 31st, 2022. And also greetings to those of you in the audience and those of you on the live stream watching around campus. I have a series of titles for the themes for the worship service here, the chapel service here. And this week's theme is a phrase that I learned in my training as a chaplain. So it's not a commonplace phrase, but the phrase is recovery of soul. And that might send you in particular directions, which is great. I'd like to explain to you a little bit what the phrase means to me and how it relates to being here and end up with a plea. So, a fellow about 100 years ago named Anton Boysen was a pastor with a significant mental health disorder, and he ended up in a psychiatric hospital. So when I think about what psychiatric hospitals must have looked like in the 1920s, I think of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and perhaps even more grim experiences. But I don't think it was quite like Caron, and even some of you who are at Caron have been in psych hospitals today, and I think they're a big step up from what they might have looked like 100 years ago. So anyway, he describes this experience of becoming a psychiatric patient and emerging out of psychiatric hospitalization in his signature book, which is called Out of the Depths. And even the title suggests something of how he felt about the experience, which was it was a into the depths and then out of the depths thing. And as he becomes what he would become, which is one of the co-founders, principal people that are looked at to understand modern chaplaincy. And even the two co-founders, we didn't work together, so it's like almost like Freud and Jung. They were contemporaries, but not close colleagues in their approach. Anton Boysen's approach to chaplaincy was informed by his journey into the depths and out of it. And he spoke about the task of a chaplain as recovery of soul. That's not just in addiction treatment, it's just his general notion of what a chaplain is out there sort of recovering souls. And I suppose when now I say that aloud, I'm thinking about when I was growing up. I had this very strong anti-Christian bias after having grown up in a certain expression of Christianity household and then leaving it behind. And I was this atheist who thought that people who professed Jesus as some sort of savior and tried to recruit other people to it were not welcome in my sphere. And notice where I am today, haha. But so the phrase recovery of soul, I would have interpreted in that way, like out there, trying to recruitment of soul. But he doesn't mean recruitment of soul. He means a soul in distress that needs help. And this becomes part of the ethics of chaplaincy actually today, is that chaplaincy ethics is specifically non-evangelistic. It's non-recruiting. So, and you may not know that, but it's true in hospitals and hospice settings, even in the military and in campus experiences, although less so in both of those settings, but definitely in behavioral health care. A chaplain who knows what the ethics of chaplaincy are is specifically encouraged and required by those ethics not to proselytize. And this is a little off track, but anyway, so there's this question that operates whenever I approach this topic of what does the soul mean? What does that term mean? And I always think, how am I going to approach it? So there are people in the room who have heard me approach this topic many different times in different ways, and I have a new slant on the topic today. This comes from a radio show that I heard several years ago, in which I went and retrieved, recovered. It's called Radio Lab, and I don't know if any of you are public radio listeners, but Radio Lab is a public radio TV show, broadcast. And on Radio Lab, there's this quirky fellow named Robert Krulwich, who does these Radio Lab interviews. And Krulwich did an interview a number of years ago, not an interview, but a piece. It was on animal cognition. And the story is about a a ship captain in San Francisco who a number of years ago, this is a true story, received a call in the middle of a winter night informing him that there was a whale in distress about 18 miles offshore through the Golden Gate Bridge and out in the Pacific Ocean. And they were letting him know because he was thought to be a person who might be able to sort of mount a rescue effort. And so the guy did contact people, divers and other people, like a guy who worked in Coast Guard rescue and everything, and they put together a team, and within a couple hours they were setting out. They went out looking for this animal as the sun was coming up, and they get in the general vicinity of the coordinates where they were, and then of course they did eventually see just the crest of the front of this whale with its blowhole above water, but in very distressed breathing, and surrounded by the detritus of various crab pots, ropes and buoys that would keep these nets and the traps afloat. And not to take all of my minutes just telling this story, they mount a rescue effort, and there are a number of, they realize they can't just like run their inflatable boats up to the whale because the whale has this big pectoral fin that it swamps, and it feels threatened when they bring boats up. So eventually they just jump in the water with their knives, and they go up to the whale and they start cutting the entrapments around the whale, which there are like pieces of blubber, and the whale has been very injured by the cutting of these ropes as it's tried to free itself from this thing, and the tail is pointing downwards instead of up. It's got weight of crab pots holding the tail down. And one of the swimmers, a guy named Tim, ends up at the head of the whale, and he sees this grapefruit-sized eyeball watching him go this way and that way. And he can tell that when he's moving this way, the eye is tracking him this way, and then the eye is tracking him that way. And this is after the pectoral fin has pushed the boats away, so he's a little bit anxious about the dynamic between him and this large animal. It turns out it's a humpback whale. It's about the size of a school bus, estimated to weigh about 50 tons. And so Tim is working around the eye, cutting, and there are other divers that are working around the rest of the body, and there's a guy who's all the way down near the tail. And anyway, to cut the story short, it takes them several hours, most of the day, to free the whale, and eventually the guy who's near the tail has to cut the flesh of the whale to get his knife underneath this final, like, last straw piece of line, and all those crab pots start drifting, and the whale disappears. So he comes up to the surface, and there's Tim, the guy who'd been at the front, and the other divers, and they're all like, yay, woo, we did it, we saved this beast of the sea, and they were so excited, just like dynamically, but this is not the end of the story. Then Tim, the guy who was on the front of the crew, looks down into the water, and he can see the whale coming right straight at him from the deep. And he's like, whoa. He doesn't know what's going on. So the whale comes sort of rushing up to him, but stops just, one of the divers said it was 18 inches was the distance that he thought it was. And then bumps him in the water, and then bumps him again and bumps him again. Multiple like taps on the chest. Then rolls around and brings his eyeball right to the diver, like checking you out. And then goes to every other diver in the crew and does the same thing. Tap, tap, tap. And does it to the boats also, which I think is interesting, because as far as the whale is concerned, the boats have been part of the rescue operation. But the point of the radio show was the whale stayed with the crew. The crew had to leave the whale instead of the whale leaving the crew. First of all, I would think the whale would want to get the heck out of Dodge because that was not a safe environment, it's a sort of trauma environment. But the experience of all of the divers was their sensibility was that the whale had stayed to say thank you, right? And I'm totally on board with them. Then they had on the radio lab, they had some animal psychologist who said, no, it's not necessarily a thank you. But the animal psychologist had to say, well, it is interesting that the animal took specific interest in each of the participants. So, the psychologist, don't tell my colleague I said that, but They want to demystify what I think is the mystical. What I'm talking about, and why I bring it up, is that other times when I've talked about soul, I have talked about eye-to-eye contact. And I think that eye-to-eye contact is a place where we experience something that is beyond the mere physiological about our concreteness. I was lying on the floor on Friday night with my granddaughter, Charlotte. She's 4 years old. She loves to put herself under a blanket at any hour of the day and pretend she's going to sleep. And so I threw myself down on them, and I'm like, let's take a nap, Charlotte. And she and I were eye to eye. It was one of my favorite moments of this past weekend. And it was a soul encounter, as far as I'm concerned. It was a soul encounter. And so I was trying to think about how to talk about soulfulness. I was thinking about all of the different ways we talk about soul. Soul music. How do I say this? And I was going to say, well, and I'm going to say it now. Alexa and Siri do not have souls, right? And we can recognize that even though we don't have an eyeball to eyeball. My Siri looks like an eyeball on my iPhone, but I don't have any question about that. And artificial intelligence's quest is in some sense to create an entity in an automated thing that would fool us. That's called the Turing test. If we could have an interaction with the machine and not be able to tell whether it was a human being or not, would be the consummate achievement of AI. Although AI has sort of diverted away from that as its central project today. And now the core project of AI tends to be more to make machines that are helpers and use heuristics to be able to sort of do their help better without trying to make them entities of their own that can take over the world and annihilate us. So I don't know if you are dubious about the existence of the soul, or if you struggle with me talking about it. But like I was poking fun at the psychological team, I think that those who struggle with this term are telling us something about where they feel safe, which is in a the term soul is intensely poetic, and so like the word love, or like I don't even know, I don't have a bucket of other words to pull up at, but poetry, we're going to hear a poem later this morning, which I just love, and it's full of words like malleable and murky, and the alliteration of the poem is part of its meaning, and I think people who want to debate the existence of soul are telling us that they are struggling with their experience of soul, and are uncomfortable with what I'm talking about. Because where I find the soul to be most clearly present is in interaction. Whether Tim with the whale, or whether me with Charlotte, or whether you with those who seek to be in loving connection with you. This is an interesting thing that I arrived at this week, is to say, I'm going to make the hypothesis while out here that I don't think the soul can be understood in isolation. I think the soul is a thing that is experienced in connection to other souls. I can't prove the soul. I don't know what it is, except I know when I look at Jake and he looks back at me, I see you seeing me see you, right? And there's this soul acknowledgement that happens just like that. Beautiful, fantastic, extraordinary. Then, if that's what I'm talking about, is this thing that has the capacity to spark in interconnection with another such thing, even across species, what would it mean to say that you come to Caron with a distressed soul? My dear friend and mentor and colleague, Father Bill Holtberg, used to say that very thing about addiction, was that some diseases attack the body, some diseases attack the body and mind, but addiction is unique in that it goes first for the soul. I think now I'm like, oh, I understand what you're saying, Bill. Because there's some, I used to think that with my own little suspicious, distant, sort of prefer the science land kind of place. And now I've become this grandparent to this little girl and other ways in which this has expressed itself in my life. And I believe that it is fair to describe the project that presents itself for the person with the wristband in this room or on the live stream, meaning the Caron patient, as at least a principal aspect of it, recovery or retrieval of a wounded, trapped soul. You are like a whale in distress, and very much like the fetters of the crab traps. It is the crackpot and the heroin and the Johnny Walker Red that is and one of the instances in which I would point to as a defense, a bridge between my own preference for the subjective and poetic and those who are more analytical and scientific, is the word of Nora Volkow, who is one of the principal scientists in the thinking of addiction in the United States. Nora Volkow is the head of NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse. That's an old framing, by the way, it should be renamed. And because many of you are not abusers of drugs, you become prey to a disease which is a use disorder. So it's the National Institute of Substance Use Disorder, perhaps. Anyway, NISUD, we're going to rename it today. So Nora Volkow reached her position as the head of NIDA in part by being one of the pioneering scientists to do brain scans of people in addiction and coming out of addiction, and noticing that there was a differentiation between the addicted brain and the 45-day and 90-day post-addicted brain for the cocaine user. And what she was able to show was that in the healthier brain, there's this capacity of the front cortex, the thinking part of the brain, to influence the midbrain, which is the more emotional and intuitive and passionate and kind of drivenness. And that what happens is that the activities in those two centers of the brain, which previously were correlated, in an addict becomes all the midbrain. So that in an addict, the midbrain fires and the front lobe can't activate to like think through and catch your impulsive behavior. So a term she used was hijacked brains. And this has become very, very well known in addiction medicine. People talk, like all of our medical professionals will teach the hijacked brain theory. Isn't that a soul captivity language, right? So all of a sudden I've got Nora Volkow and NIDA on board with what I'm talking about. I think, and I don't mean to make it so self-centered about me, I'm just saying that there's a thing here. If it represents itself, and in psychology I can show you another place where they're talking about people who have suffered from trauma and what they're calling now soul injury. So in mental health care and in medical science of the more biophysical aspect, and in the spiritual care, we have this alignment of studying people with behavioral health disorders and being able to conceive of the thing as essentially captivity or injury or this kind of fundamental distress. And what is impaired is relationship. So the medicine is the piece that is lost. And the healing of this particular kind of injury, this is my personal belief, I'm not sure Nora Volkow or our psychological team would agree with me entirely, because they're going to bring other tools to the table. They're going to bring pharmacological tools to the table, and they're going to bring psychological methods to the table. And I'm all for that. I'm all for anything that helps. But I also believe that those pharmacological methods and those psychological methods are only going to help if you trust and love the person who is delivering them. And that there's this fundamental aspect of the healing experience of people who get well from opioid use disorder and alcohol use disorder and even sex and love addiction, all that sort of stuff, which is trusting relationship. You can look and see whether they find, and you can look at Alcoholics Anonymous and find that sponsorship is this fundamental aspect, that People who do get sponsors and use sponsors and follow the steps with a sponsor tend to flourish more than people who are like, nah, I don't need that. I don't need a Yoda or a Gandalf. I'm going to be fine on my own. Frodo said that. He'd have never made it, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that soul retrieval's central and sine qua non, that without which it's not going to happen, is love. And I hope you find that good news. But there are lots of people who are very, very distrustful of love and of loving care from providers. For good reason, sadly. There are lots of people who have pretended to be loving, but who have exploited and done more harm through luring people in and then violating that confidence and trust. So if you're a trauma survivor, this could be a tricky message. But it is. This is my plea. My plea is to let us help. And if you find yourself petrol thin, get the hell away from me. Try to recognize that's a fear response from the fetters and the distressed thing that's happened here. And that you are in a place where there's a bunch of divers who know how to cut the ropes that bind you. Let us love you until you can love yourselves. That's the historic message of the Caron organization. It goes back to not just Bill Hultberg, but John Flannery. There's Flannery Way named out there, and to Dick Caron. This is one of the things that distinguishes Caron as an entity. When you go to other treatment centers, they don't have historic core messaging like that. This is core messaging of this place. Let us love you until we can love, until you can love yourself. And love others in a healthier way. So may it be. Thanks.